はい、それでは、時間となりましたので、これから第2項目、ミカエル・アドルフソン先生より、日本史における寺院の平安と僧兵と題して、ご講演をいただきます。それでは先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Hello everyone, I like to walk around and speak, so I'll be a little bit more mobile here. First, I'd like to, of course, thank the Ishibashi Foundation for sponsoring these kinds of events. As you know, this is the 5th time, and I think this is a wonderful opportunity to look at various aspects of Japanese culture, art, and history from the angle that is provided from abroad. I'm particularly honored by this because, to me, you usually get the question, what can you possibly add to what Japanese historians already know about Japan? And it is true that we benefit tremendously from their work. We probably don't read the sources quite as well, do we? Or we try. But we do bring a slightly different perspective, and I'm hoping to give one example of that today. I also want to thank the Kokugakuin University for hosting this event. It's a wonderful location to be at. Also Simon Kainer from UA for inviting us, as well Lisi Richardson for a kind introduction. Now, my topic is along the same lines, so Professor Friday, who by the way is my senpai, so that's why he had to go first, since I'm the younger one. And I will be talking about one particular character within the history of Japanese warfare, and as you can see, they usually refer to as Sōhei. A bad translation of that, in my opinion, is monk warriors. Although very often it ends up being warrior monks for some reason, even though it very clearly shows the character from monk first. I prefer to call them monastic warriors, and I hope to convince you why that is a better translation to begin with. But before I get into that, I actually want to talk a little bit about the samurai that we just heard about, because we can't really understand why there is an even concept of Sōhei unless we also understand where the samurai comes from. So I want to start with something very basic. Samurai images sell, and they sell well. I assume that you're familiar with this team here. This, of course, is Japan's national football team, where I come from. Soccer team, I think, is the term that we use here. And of course, they're known as samurai group. So there's a very clear connotation here with something with the samurai, with the spirit of the samurai, loyalty, willingness to sacrifice themselves, and so forth. But of course, it goes well beyond this in Japanese culture. Samurai sells well for companies. Some of you may have seen this picture a few years ago. Here we see a businessman, of course, in his business suit. In fact, I'm almost the same color. And, you know, he holds a sword, of course, to give us the idea that this, in fact, is a samurai. So there's some connection here between the Japanese salaryman and the samurai. But then, instead of his chonmage, instead of his top knot, he has a certain drink bottle on his head. And this is, of course, an attempt to sell that particular drink, reusing the samurai image. My favorite by far is this one, which is a very subtle commercial. If you look very carefully, those of you who are interested in martial arts, this is probably what I would think is the most maybe traditional of the martial arts, namely kendo. Right? You probably will recognize the kendo gear that he's wearing. You can also see a kendo gear in the background. He's holding a sword, and he is skinning an apple with a sword, which is something that's very difficult to do, of course. That's part of it. So what is this a commercial for? You have to look all the way to the corner to see that it is for a softener, something to make your laundry soft. And if you've ever been in a kendo dojo, you know what it smells like. And you know what kind of, like how stiff that gear is, because you've been hanging out there for months. And here, so they're saying, well, if you use the softness, but we're all soft and nice. But again, they're using a samurai image to do this. So this is something that is very prevalent today, and you can find numerous examples of it across Japan even today. Now, one of the challenges for us, and Professor Friday alluded to this in many different ways, is how do we define the Japanese warrior? And he has already talked about, very often it's the mounted warrior, and very often it is the sword. We just see here in a pretty old image, in fact, of a Japanese warrior. But this becomes very problematized if we use an image from a very similar period. These are all medieval images. And here we see people who are clearly not professional warriors, but they all have weapons. And so very clearly these two people here, they have shaved head. That means is that they are Buddhist monks, and they are carrying weapons. You see someone who's probably not a monk over there, and he is kind of swirling around in a kind of water wheel maneuver maybe, kind of to show his skills. We see both these glaives, as they call, or naginata in Japanese, I'm going to talk about that quite a bit, but also swords. So how do they fit into this image with the samurai? Well, they really don't. But what they do tell us is that medieval Japan, there was no monopoly on weapons. Anyone could pick up a weapon and fight. And this is actually part of the problem with thinking about samurai, because the samurai is a professional class that has weapons. But in medieval times, anyone could pick up a weapon and fight. There was really no restriction against that. Another way to define the samurai is by comparing them to other figures. And of course, the one that is often compared to the samurai is a medieval knight. And Professor Friday also alluded to that. This is a wonderful, very romanticized image of medieval knight. This is actually from the 19th century, so way after they're gone. But you see again, he's also mounted. It's the same thing. The difference in Europe, of course, is that there is in fact more or less a monopoly on weapons. So only certain people can have these kind of weapons. The other aspect to this, of course, is chivalry. In other words, the medieval knight was chivalrous towards women, for example. I mean, they held them on a pedestal, and, oh, thank you. This actually worked, I tried. And so, what's interesting about these images is that someone came up with a bright idea that they were basically the same. And you may be familiar with that person. His name is Nitobe Inazo. Late Meiji and early 20th century diplomat. He was very active as a peacemaker, in fact. I'm originally Swedish. He actually settled a dispute between Sweden and Finland. It's very interesting. But he also wrote this fabulous book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan. And I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but in fact, it was written first in English, not in Japanese. And it was published in the year 1900 to tell the world that, look, we Japanese have a very similar history to Europe. Your knights are our samurai. And so he specifically compared them. In part, of course, it was to say that we have the same kind of history, therefore we are now going into the same kind of future. We're developing as a capitalist country, industrialized country, and so forth. This book, which by the way also claims that all Japanese, of course, have this Bushido soul in them somehow, is very popular to this day. So this is a more recent translation into English, and you can kind of see all the symbols there, including, interesting, the character for eternity in the middle. I don't know what he's doing there, but if you look for this book, you'll find 10 or 15 different editions that you can buy. So still a highly popular book. Now, there is another way that we can define the samurai, and that is through contrast. Here I put up an image of a samurai from the Tokugawa period. Contrast is very important. Without contrast, there is no other. Without other, we have very few ways of actually defining who we are. So if there were no countries in the world, we wouldn't talk about being Japanese or being Swedish or being British or whatever it was. We need a contrast to define ourselves. And it's in this context, in fact, that in particular this image becomes important. And I think you can see, I will go into this quite a bit in detail in a bit, but I think you can see very easily the contrast between these two images. Now, this is a modern rendition of this. This is an actual picture of a samurai from the Edo period. It's been called a little later, but we will see that these contrasts are enormously important. You can see that in the way they dress. You can see it in the weaponry that they seem to prefer. But most important is the connotation. This is something very positive, something to aspire to. This is something extremely negative, something to not appreciate. And those negative connotations, in fact, are very powerful in today's Japan as well. So I'm going to give you a little bit of personal history now. This article was written in 1985. This one in 1986. 1986, and I'm going to reveal partly my age here, was the year I came to Japan. And I was in Osaka, but I wanted to go to Kyoto. And I wanted to go see some temples. But in 1985, the mayor of Kyoto had suggested that they would impose a new tourist tax on 40 of Kyoto's most popular tourist attractions. 36 of those 40 attractions or temples. Temples, as you know, are usually tax exempt in Japan, so they were not very happy with this taxation. It was not a lot. I mean, this is the 1980s, but it was 50 yen per adult and 30 yen per child. But, of course, the temples wanted to take the tax exempt status. So, the temples decided to protest this by closing the gates to their temples. As it turns out, that's a very old strategy that temples were using 1,000 years before them, actually. And so when I came in 1986, the temples were closed. I had no idea why until almost 20 years later, I started doing research on the Sōhei, and I found these articles, and that's what happened. Now, what's so fabulous about this is that, please look at these monks. I hope you can see them. Here are the monks on the right side. Do they look like Sōhei? No, right? They are very peaceful monks who are protesting this tax. And yet, if you look at the titles of this, so I'm going to translate one of them on your left first. So, one headline read, Monk warriors riot against the old capital's new tax. Another said, the riots of monk warriors have not yet ended. And the second article also says, the riots of monk warriors no longer exist, but when one looks at the dispute surrounding the old capital tax, one realizes that Kyoto is a historical city that is still tied to its medieval heritage. But why do they use a Sōhei image with these peaceful monks? Because the journalists were very critical of the temple's opposition to this tax. And so they invoked the most negative image that they can possibly find. And that image was of the Sōhei. They don't even look like the Sōhei. I'll give you one more example. Ishibashi Shōtaro, Manga Nihon no Legacy. Wonderful series of people who want to learn about Japanese history very quickly. Absolutely fantastic. This particular volume, volume 13, is about the very volatile period in the late 12th century with Uchikawa, the retired emperor, as the main person. And this was a time when temples were frequently upset with how they were treated by the imperial court. In fact, they developed a particular strategy of protesting, known as divine demonstrations, goso in Japanese. and they would go down to the capital. They came from Enrakuji, Kofuji, or Todaiji. Those were basically the only three temples. And they carried with them the Mikoshi, the portable shrine, and went to the temple, and went to the imperial palace to demonstrate. Now, what you see here is not only are the Mikoshi set afire, which I have not seen any records of, but you see every single monk here is dressed as a Sōhei. And of course, they are all armed. Historical record does not show any instances of armed monks coming down to do these protests. Right? They're just protesting against this particular policy at that time. And if they ever encountered warriors, which they did, they ran away very quickly. Now they left the Mikoshi behind because that was a spiritual friend. But they didn't battle them. So again, this is a misrepresentation of the actual time. Okay, now I should say, all Sōhei are bad except for one. And you all know who he is. His name is Benkei, right? I'm very happy to talk more about why he is not a negative image, but what I want to point out here is how he was dressed, right? He got the same kind of dress as the other ones. This image is from his supposed birthplace in Kitanabe, which is about an hour and a half south of Osaka. And I don't know if you're familiar with this. I went down there in 2005, and I had no idea, but my timing was perfect. I got down there at the Benkei Matsuri. They have a Benkei festival. It's not a very traditional festival. It was first held in 1986. But I did check. And they did hold it this year again for the 32nd time in early October. So if you are interested, you should definitely go. When I was there, I ran into these very nice people. It's basically a dance troupe performance. And I don't know, I've taken a lot of pictures of Japanese, but they never look like this. They always look like this, right? Look at their expression. The expression of the Sōhei obviously has to be like, they have to be very angry and very, very threatening. So this is what the images of the Sōhei look like. Now I put up the one from the Western source that I mentioned before, and the other one from a Japanese source. And they are almost identical, not quite. So what they're wearing, let's look very carefully at what they're actually wearing. They're wearing something called a head cowl, kato in Japanese. Both of them. They're also wearing a monk garment. They're fighting it. And they have the very famous blade, the naginata. That's kind of the archetypical weapon for the Sōhei. Now, in this case, they also do carry a small sword as well. They also very often are wearing geta, or clogs, as well. Now, before I move on, I just want you to think about how that equipment would work on a battlefield. The geta would not work well if it's mud, because they would get stuck. Right? The monk garment is actually very much an obstacle because it's big and it's kind of surrounding them. The head cowl probably impedes your vision. You can't even see. So there are a lot of problems with these particular images. So what I want to do now is to go back a little bit and look at some picture scrolls that show various kinds of images of monks fighting. And I want to start with those that actually led to this image, because there is a historical background to that. So I'm going to start with a picture scroll from the early 14th century. This is a scroll that focuses on the life of Ippen, the monk, Ippen. And he was walking around in Japan and preaching his faith, which was one of the kind of new, we call Kamakura Buddhist faith. But when he was doing that, occasionally he would run into resistance from the older temples. So this supposedly represents monks from one of the Enrakuji branch temples. And of course, they're shown here with geta, head cowl, naginata, and monk garment. And then they're running away here. But we also see some other people. So they're not all dressed as so-called Sōhei. Now, I should mention that this role, of course, is sponsored by members of the faith of Ippen, who are very critical to the secular power of temples like Enrakuji. So there is a bias in this image already. Let's move forward 200 years. Early 16th century. This is quite a well-known picture, actually made by Tosa Mitsunobu, for those of you who are into art, who served very much the rising warrior class. And the rising warrior class were not happy about the big temples having so much power. In fact, the number one obstacle for the so-called three great unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and so forth, were the great temples in central Japan. And they were beaten by these two guys in the late 16th century. So there is also there already a bias. But what we see here is a kind of a new image of this. This is supposed to demonstrate an event in 1165, when the emperor had just died, Emperor Nijo. And the monks from Enrakuji, Tomodaiji, and Kofuji, these are all the old established temples, were arguing over basically seating arrangements. Seating in these kind of ceremonies was important for reflecting their status. So they got into a brawl, they started getting people with weapons, and they started fighting. When in this image, we see that the Sōhei image has kind of evolved. Now everyone is carrying the naginata. Everyone looks like there's some kind of Sōhei. So we see now that for artists, this has become a trope. If you are fighting for a quote-unquote bad temple, in this case one of the established temples, you're likely to be depicted by people who don't like what you're doing. Now if we move forward just a tiny bit into the 18th century, here we see a representation of the kind of demonstration that I showed you before from Ishinomori's manga book. This is one of the earliest representations of one of those demonstrations that shows, in fact, warriors. And here, I know it's a little hard to see, but these are all dressed like these kind of Sōhei image, early 18th century. But in addition to the weapons, they also have shields now. So again, we see that this trope has become a way of criticizing these traditional temples for what they were doing. Again, this is early 18th century, so it's even actually later than that. Now, what is important about this image is that it's only one narrative. It's only one strand that we find within artistic works. I've been showing you all of those that lead up, in fact, to these kind of negative Sōhei image. But it's not the only image we have. We have several other images as well. And by far, I think the most important one is actually this one. So to give you a little bit of background, this is a fight between monks or clerics from the temple of Kofuji in Nara and government warriors from the imperial court. The background is that in 1113, this dates from the early 14th century, so about 200 years after the event. And in 1113, there was a fight or conflict between Enrakuji and Kofuji. So the Enrakuji monks are basically attacking a place in Kyoto, and then the Nara monks want to retaliate, so they set off to the capital. Now the imperial court doesn't want them to come to the capital, so they send out their own warriors. Here is the trick here. How do we see the difference between the Nara monks and the government monks? We don't see the Sōhei image anymore. There are no Sōhei here. The only way we can see which ones come from Kofuji is by focusing on a total of 3 different monks. One here, and then one on top. They all have the kato. They all have the head cap. But everything else is exactly like all other warriors. Right? On the top, he's got a bow and arrow. He's mounted. This is not the Sōhei image that we've seen before. The only way we know that these people are probably from Kofi is because they're coming from the same direction. So these guys over here must be coming from the government side. And they seem to do exactly the same thing. They're both mounted sometimes, some are foot soldiers, but they all look the same. They're using the same weapons. And the naginata that's used here is not just used by these guys, it's used by those guys too. So what do we do with this image? This is a different narrative of how the warriors fighting for temples actually fought. And I can give you a little bit more detail here, so you can see even better. And you see, there is no different except those three monks, they have the head cowl. So what do we do with these? Well, let me talk a little bit about weaponry, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about here, I think. I just had one of these. So, in the 13th century, we have a record from the great temple in Nara, Todaji, who visited, there were monks from Kyoto, visited Todaji in 1212 to attend the ceremony. And after the ceremony was over, several of the monks from Kyoto went to watch a kind of exhibit of warrior skills. And they were very excited because what they got to see were lower level clerics, novices from Todaji, riding on horseback and doing the yabusame. They were shooting arrows from horseback. Now this is not something that we usually associate with monastic, with Sōhei. This is something completely different. I'm going to introduce you to someone else. His name is Jōmyō Myōshū. He is a fictional character in the very, very famous war tale, Heike Monogatari. I think most people, even outside Japan, are familiar with the tale of Genji Monogatari. Heike Monogatari arguably maybe is the second best known medieval literary work. And there's a very interesting account of these Jōmyō Myōshū. And I'm going to take some time to read this because it shows us again a different strand of these warrior fighting for a temple. So I'll do my best. I have to do Nanori first. You must have heard of me long ago. See me now with your own eyes. Everyone at Niigata knows me. I am the workingman Jōmyō Myōshū from Tsutsui, a warrior worth 1,000 men. Warrior, not monk. A warrior worth 1,000 men. If any here consider themselves my equals, let them come forward. I will lead them. He let fly a fast and furious barrage from his 24-hour quiver, which killed 12 men instantly and wounded 11 others. Very good ratio. Then, with one arrow left, he sent the bow clattering away, untied and discarded the quiver. He cast off his fur boots, no clogs here, the fur boots, and ran nimbly along a bridge beam in his bare feet. This is illustrated here. This battle takes place at Fuji River, actually, and the bridge has been damaged, and he runs across it anyway, even though the beams are still there. So, he mowed down 5 enemies with his spear, so that's the naginata, and was engaging a 6th when the blade snapped in the middle. He abandoned the weapon and fought with his sword. Hard pressed by the enemy host, he slashed in every direction, using the zigzag, interlacing, crosswise, dragonfly reverse, and water wheel maneuvers. I have no idea what those are, but I think you can imagine them yourselves. After cutting down 8 men on the spot, he struck the helmet top of the 9th so hard that the blade snapped on the hilt rivet, slipped loose, and splashed into the river. Then he fought on desperately with the dirk as his sole resource. So he used bow and arrow, naginata, sword, and dirk, just like any other warrior might do if they were in that situation. Keep in mind, he was never on horseback. This is a guy who is on foot. So, in other words, no clogs, no head cowl, and no mentioning of a monk robe. In fact, if you go further on, it actually says that he takes off his weapons, puts on a monk robe, and puts on his clothes, and then walks away. So this comes after. This is not part of the battle. What we have here, to use an English term, is something we call competing narratives. In other words, we have more than one interpretation, even in literary, artistic works, of how people fighting for temples actually fought. So what has happened, of course, is that one of them has taken over. But in reality, if you look at medieval times, we actually see two. So who were the Sōhei then? Well, I got news for you. If you didn't know this already, the term never appears in pre-modern Japanese sources. The term doesn't exist. That is very important. When does it come into Japan? Well, the first known usage we know is 1715. This wonderful Tokugawa period that is very creative and where they rewrite their own history in order to justify the rule of the samurai. 1715. Now, in reality, it probably came into Japan very late in the 16th century because it's a Korean term, sumgo, that was used, in fact, to describe the monks who fought against Hideyoshi's armies in the late 16th century. But it certainly did not exist at the time when temples actually had warriors. So any attempts that have been made to match the term Sōhei with one particular group in Japanese history is doomed to fail. And this is what many scholars spent many years doing. Okay? Which group is the Sōhei? Which one does it actually connect to? And in reality, those who fought for temples came from very different backgrounds and were referred to in very different ways. On the one hand, we actually have provincial warriors fighting for temples. If you're looking at the terms used, they are sometimes referred to as Bushi or Heishi, sometimes referred to as Sōhei, which, of course, these are warriors coming from one of the many estates under the control of the temples. Sometimes are referred to as Gunkyo or Gunpei, bands of warriors. And sometimes, and this might be of interest to those of you who are here at Kokugakuin, they're referred to as jinin. And jinin are basically shrine servants. These are people who are serving in the shrines in some function. They may sweep the grounds, maybe they're repairmen, but they also have the ability to pick up weapons. Each of these groups are in medieval records, in medieval sources, fighting for temples, but no Sōhei. And then, on the other hand, we actually have warriors who resided within the temples. And we have a different kind of band of terms for them. The most intriguing one is Akuso. And many of Akuso are the Sōhei. And it is true, very often, these monks were, these evil monks, were in fact armed. But there were also armed monks who were not called Akuso, because the term Aku is always used mostly by the imperial court or by the nobles writing the diaries to critique people who are going against the order in Kyoto. So we know, for example, in 1156, where there's the first of the many big battles that are happening, or small battles actually, that happen in Kyoto, is that one of the sides were recruiting warriors from Kofuji. They're not referred to as Akuso because they need their help. So Aku is a relative term. It has nothing to do whether you're armed or not. It has to do with side you're on. If you're on the wrong side, you're an Akuso. We also see Daishu, which just means clergymen. That could be anyone. They too could pick up weapons. You see also something called Doshu, which are hall clergy. They're usually kind of menial workers. Again, they help clean the grounds, they prepare for ceremonies, and they could pick up weapons if the need was there. So, there are no Sōhei. These are all different groups fighting for the temple. Now, I want to look a little bit, come back to Benkei. This is an image from very early in the 17th century. It's a wood painting done by the very well-known painter Hasegawa Tohaku. And so this is just after the temples have lost all the military power. There are no military men fighting for temples anymore. Benkei is sitting here in the back of the horse, and there is not a single sign that he is a monk on this image. He has just captured one of the people sent out by his master's brother. He served the famous Yoshitsune, of course, and is taking him back to Yoshitsune to interrogate him. But again, he looks entirely like a warrior. So he has not yet become this kind of archetypical Sōhei that you will see. Now, over the Tokugawa period, from 1600 up to 1868, these competing images, these kind of images, disappear. And every single representation in the Tokugawa period moving forward will show everyone fighting for a temple wearing the same kind of garment, having the same kind of weapon. Now, I want to skip forward quite a bit and actually jump up to the almost present day. This is Benkei. I want to show you another Benkei. I hope that some of you are as much a fan of NHK Taiga drama as I am. This annual series of 50 weeks of wonderful historical programs. In 2005, it focused on Yoshitsune, right? Yoshitsune, the big warrior hero in the 12th century. As many of you probably know, Benkei was a very loyal follower of Yoshitsune. And this is just before the episode when Benkei comes up. Says, Benkei is coming, here's coming, right? I assume that some of you may also recognize this actor who I have the greatest respect for, Matsudaira Ken. It's a very nice job of acting in those cases, but I'm going to show you a clip, if everything works. When Yoshitsune surprises the Taira army by attacking them from a very steep slope at the Ichimotani battle, and I want to ask you to please pay attention to poor Matsudaira Ken, because he is part of this, and I want you to look at how he is portrayed and how well he does in portraying this particular Benkei. He's on a horseback. That's all I'm going to say for now. Let's pray and make sure that this works. This is. See that his naginata is at least 10 foot, maybe more. Kata. examples with naginata being used on the horseback? No, because there are not a single example of that happening in pre-modern Japan. I think if you watch Matsudaira Ken, and I really feel sorry for him, when he's got a 10-foot long naginata and he's trying to cut in the scene, and all he's doing is like this. It's not possible to actually use a naginata effectively the way they try to do. So what has happened here is very, very clear. The producers have in mind, Benkei is a Sōhei. He needs to be dressed like a Sōhei, and he needs to fight like a Sōhei. So they put him on a horseback with naginata, which makes absolutely no sense. It's not possible to do technically, and there certainly is no evidence for it anywhere in medieval Japanese sources. So this tells us the impact such an image has, when even technically it doesn't make sense for Matsudaira Ken to actually use this, they still put it into play. And so for me, this was the revelation of why this image is so strong in Japan, and why, I hope, I need to make a case that, look, this doesn't make any sense. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up by giving my main points of my little presentation. So, first of all, the Sōhei never existed. The term, of course, never existed during medieval times, but in fact, there was not a separate group of people that we can even identify as Sōhei. Simply is not supported in the documents and the sources. Rather, what we have to understand is that monastic warriors, not Sōhei. Sōhei is a construct. It's something they came up with later. Monastic warriors were no different from the regular secular warriors when we talk about Japan's warrior history. They fought the same way, they used the same weapons, and in fact, they looked the same way. There's no way that you would have been able, in fact, to tell the difference between them. The commanders of the forces of the temples were, in fact, just like the commanders of the secular forces, descendants of the Taira, the Minamoto, and the Fujiwara. No different. The only difference is that they were fighting for the temple to protect the interest of the temple rather than the noble. And that rendered them a negative influence in Japanese history, unfortunately, I think. So, this negative image, it has actually a very long history, why it's so difficult to take out. The negative image is created in the 14th century, way before there even is a term for Sōhei, as part of a criticism by the new populist Amidist sects, the Kamakura Buddhist sect that emerged in the 14th century. They use a negative image in order to say, look, our version of Buddhism is better than the old one. And then that's followed up, of course, by warriors, the so-called daimyo in the 16th centuries, who don't like the influence and the independence that these temples have. And finally, completely the Edo period, when temples no longer have any power, and in the opinion of the rulers, shouldn't have any power. And therefore, that becomes a negative trope. And it serves them, from the Edo period on, as a big contrast to the samurai. The samurai are this, and the monastic warriors are that. But in reality, they have the same origin. They were, in fact, very often related even, and they were fighting. So, keeping in mind then, that they used exactly the same weaponry, the same strategies, they built barricades just like the other warriors did, they used the bow and arrow, we've seen that, and they adhered to basically the same principle. It's very hard to tell any difference. What happened is that because of a desire to vilify, to make evil the secular power of Buddhist temples, first by these populist sects, then by warriors, and then by the Tokugawa shogunate, but also from the Meiji period on by scholars. Because in modern societies, religion should not have any secular power. But there is almost no medieval society in the world where religion didn't have power. So why is that evil in their opinion? So these very strong images have been so hard to get through, but I'm hoping to have made a case that we should. When it comes to Benkei, we do not even know if he existed. Likely he didn't actually. But if he did, he was not the only person from a monastery skilled in fighting. And nor were any monastic warriors any better or worse than their cousins, the secular warriors who fought for the nobility. They were simply part of the context of medieval Japan. And in fact, I would argue that the history of the warrior class that eventually results in the samurai owes as much debt to those fighting for temples as they do from those fighting from the nobles. Failing to do that, I think, would be to deny history. It would actually be to write a fake history, a history that lacks critical reading, and that promotes one group and does not do justice to the complexity of medieval Japan. Thank you very much for your attention.
Adolphson 先生、ありがとうございます。
You read my book? All what I said is in that book.
貴重なお話ありがとうございました。日本文化における、武士のイメージというものを明らかにした上で、中世後半からですね、台頭した僧兵について、武器や戦術をめぐるさまざまな社会的背景について、お話しいただきました。ありがとうございました。